I'm going to speak to you today about the outcomes of a 10-year treatment program which continues to date in Australia. I'm very confident about the results that we've achieved in Australia, how portable they are to other environments, to other social cultures, etc. I can't say. However, the program has been reviewed in the UK and the US, and it does appear that there's a number of portable aspects to it. A little bit of the background I think is important. I just need to make sure that I know what I'm doing here. Okay. There's a very popular writer in Australia called Steve Biddulph, and Steve wrote a book called Manhood, recognising, in fact, I'm quite interested in the last presenters. It is of no surprise to me whatsoever that boys are demonstrating more loneliness or difficulty with processing emotions, because certainly that's the finding that has been validated over and over again in Australia, that there's something in the way that as males we develop that makes us different in terms of processing strong emotions in particular and in a crisis. Steve actually said the largest and most unacknowledged mental health risk in Australia today is among recently separated and divorced men. No group of comparable size is at higher risk of suicide or of violence, depression or addictions. I should add that there were two reasons that plummeted me into this sort of work. One was the outcomes of some research done by a colleague called Chris Cantor, who looked at, there are 7 men every day suicide in Australia. That's been like that now for about the last 10 years. What wasn't known, because the coroner would just have a category of either married or single. What Chris Cantor did was spoke to state coroners in Australia and got them to look at whether they were separated, whether they were going through some sort of significant relationship breakup. And 5 out of those 7 per day were identified as suiciding in the midst of a relationship breakup. Of real interest is that they're the official statistics. They don't take into account, for example, single vehicle accidents, which those of you who work in clinical work will know that many of them have more onerous underpinnings. Or this other strange little strange category called death by misadventure, which the coroners in Australia put where they're not sure whether it's suicide or not. So it looks as though at 5/7 at least of the men in Australia who are suicide are in the midst of relationship breakdown. The other complication which adds to this, I think, is that these are based on official marriage statistics. About 1/3 of all permanent relationships in Australia are de facto relationships. The Australian Bureau of Family Studies is starting now to look at that as a significant category. So this is a big problem. This is a big problem. So that's the first thing that attenuated me to doing this work. The second was my own marriage breakup. 20 years, 4 children, family therapist, and suddenly I find myself in some strange territory. Now, I think that normal people can become quite abnormal when they're going through this sort of stress, male or female. And if you're a little bit problematic to begin with, you can become quite dangerous. However, what I want you to take away from today is that I'm very much against pathologising what is normal human behaviour. The measures we have the templates that we lay over the top of men and women going through these sorts of crises related very much to clinical measures, depression, anxiety, etc., etc. What I identified in my own personal and professional work was the need for us to put a human face on some of this, and that's why I termed the term the hostile alienation syndrome, which I believe does apply very much to males and does of great benefit in engaging males. It's got real currency, and also with depathologizing the process. So that's the banner I'm sort of waving today. There's far too much information here, and it's late in the day, so I'm going to quickly skip through a number of things and hit the highlights. But if you want to get it all, if you write this down, MENDS-PRO, MENDS-PRO, that's both the login and the password to the MENDS site, and there's this presentation plus a number of others that you may find of interest in the area. So, this very quickly shows that in 1975, suddenly divorces went through the roof. Any idea why that happened? That's because the Marriage Act was changed and it became no-fault divorce. So the way you can get a divorce in Australia is irreconcilable differences, which is 12 months separation. That's it. No trying to have to catch your partner in bed or doing something naughty. That's it. Okay? And no surprise, suddenly the divorce statistics went straight up. And they're starting to plateau now, but they're nothing like they were 20 years ago, much higher. We did some work with the helplines. These are Lifeline. I'm sure you have those sorts of 24-hour emergency service lines. And what was interesting in this, that that relationship with the partner or ex-partner was the biggest category of calls to helplines. The smallest was mental and emotional well-being. It's interesting, isn't it? So, and that's been replicated, so that's quite a big difference. What is the MENDS program? Well, it's a group program. We get men together. We have 12 weeks, 2 hours a week. It's very structured. This is another thing I've learnt, that the traditional talk therapies do not work particularly well. In fact, they're quite confusing, alienating, agitating to many men going through separation and divorce. It addresses a number of key issues, particularly self-auditing, looking at your life in an honest way, doing a courageous audit of your life, working out not only where you are, but how you got there, and to get some skills in the process, in a support process. I should add, none of this is anti-women. I have done presentations many times, and with some people or some audiences, there's this very curious idea that if you're actually doing something with men, that somehow you're anti-women. Well, MENDS is a very, very pro-social process. Mind you, if you're a fly on the wall for the first few sessions, you often hear men venting a lot and blaming the women or blaming the system or blaming everyone else. What we see is a change of that process over time. We identified a thing called a therapeutic pathway in this process. Don't worry about that. So we create this male-friendly environment. We never use the word help. Any idea why you never use the word help with men in crisis? It's the kiss of death. No man, no Australian man, I guess it would apply to many men, wants to feel weak. They already know they're weak. They already know they're debilitated. So we talk about structure, and we talk about direction, and we talk about tools for change. But we never talk that sort of fluffy stuff, you know, that touchy-feely kind of psychobabble that we're so good at. One of the things I learnt in this process, I learnt when I was working in prisons. So I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist, and I worked many years in the public sector in prisons. And we would do these wonderful CBT interventions, and we'd get good short-term effects, but very little long-term changes. Back they'd come into prison and we'd look at it. I was talking to one of the gurus in the area, and that person said, "Do you do any narrative work?" I had no idea what narrative work was. But over time, what we've developed is a tool called a structured autobiography, where we get participants to systematically write their own story of their life. We make it easy because they just have to answer certain questions. Now, I've found professionally that using cognitive behavioural techniques without having some capacity for your client to look at themselves, to feel clearer about their own identity, that those CBT techniques do not graft. Or if they do, they're not taken internally in terms of how the person thinks about themselves. So that particular learning was transported into this program. Just briefly, Dennis Ludbrook did some research to show the kind of trajectories that men go through during separation crisis. And he called it the 4 Fs. The bottom one, the freeze, that's the stereotypical male who's still in love with the partner and can't move on. It's over, but they don't want it to be over, and they're holding on. The fight is the angry one, the one who lashes out. The flight is the party animal, the one who gets into all sorts of self-destructive substance abuse, other relationships, etc. And Ludbrook said, of course, what we're trying to do is get this person into freedom. The work we did validated Ludbrook's work very well. And we showed, I'll show you a little bit in a minute, just those categories and how that works. What I ended up doing, because this was such a journey of discovery in many ways, was to end up writing a book. This is a therapist manual, because many of the things we learnt in working with men in these numbers, and the statistics I'm going to show you in a minute are N equals, 880, I think, 880. We're up to 1,500 at the moment. So this is a very comprehensive database of men going through separation, divorce. But I wanted to actually, because many therapists working with men on a one-to-one basis have very little impact, and they will admit that to you in private. So many of the tools, many of the techniques, many of the engagement processes, many of the contracting processes, much of the structure has been taken and put into a one-on-one and also validated. So that's Australian Academic Press. You can get all that information later. And a little bit about the manual. Okay, so what we found was, when we did our groups, was because we were calling them, the first group, the frozen group, the inadequate dependent group. These are the ones who really were not coping well, not dangerous, probably more annoying, very dependent kind of people. You can look at all this later, what their typical interactional style, the behaviours that you can see, and what we identified as the benefits of involving in this group program. So in terms of containing the situation, that is their life getting worse, we had very positive outcomes with this group. And in terms of pro-social changes, we also showed high rates of transition. In terms of the flight group, this is the self-destructive group, the ones who want to be the party animals, jump into bed with everybody as quickly as possible, forget the pain in that way. We also had very positive containment rates and mixed to moderate kind of rates in terms of pro-social transition. Remembering we're only talking about 12 weeks here. This is not a one-year program. The most difficult, as you probably intuitively know, the hostile or fixated hostile or the fight group, we were able to actually contain that from getting worse. These are the people who are potentially going to hurt themselves or hurt others. But we had mixed rates in terms of the transitions. Now, that was the honest outcome, and I think it's laudable because there are very few people who have reasonable outcomes with this group, and as a group program, I think we've got something that we demonstrated in terms of positive social change. Okay, let's talk about hostile alienation. Remember what I'm trying to say here is that it's very easy to pathologise a man or a woman who's in a lot of pain as they're mad or bad. We see in front pages of Australia men and women doing outrageous things, not only to themselves but to their children. And of course, society will label them mad or bad. And it's a terrible situation. If we just come back from the more extreme, because many of these people who do act out and take their children's lives generally have some mental health background anyway. But let's look at the great majority of people who are in pain and are labelled often as dangerous, criminal, all sorts of labels. What we've identified in our studies was that when we sit them down and start to talk to them, there's this very, very distinctive cluster of thinking processes and behavioural processes that we see more like a syndrome. We see it more as something transitional, and we see it more in terms of lack of coping skills. Let's face it, nothing really prepares you for a broken heart. People write songs about it, poetry about it, make movies about it. It is one of the most difficult times of any person's life when a long-standing relationship is ended, and particularly so if there are children involved. Some of the important things here we identified is that the emotional attachments are disrupted. The friends and extended family, men will often distance themselves from that or feel very awkward. The roles, this is very important, by which many of these men identify themselves, that is, we call it the 3P, the provider, the protector, the procreator, they're changed. And they've probably changed irrevocably. So there's an identity crisis that's sitting underneath there. A lot of shame, which stops quality help-seeking behaviour. This sense of victimisation, which will often attribute blame outwards. So there's without going through it all, also the other here is that a big one for me, because I do a lot of reports for the family court in Australia. These are very yucky reports where the court, to assist the court to make decisions about where children live with mum or dad and how often they visit each other and so forth. What we found with men going through this hostile alienation syndrome, as with females I see in reports, is that when somebody's in this state, their ability to judge their own needs and to separate those from the needs of the children is distorted. And for some time, any parent who's in this state will assume that their needs are the same as the children. And if he's been a so-and-so, then the kids must see that as well. Or if she's a what's her name, then the kids must see that as well. It's just not true. So this leads on to this sort of intergenerational problem which the first speaker was talking about. There is a sad legacy, I think, of children growing up, more and more children in the Western world growing up having separated parents who have not managed this particularly well. And we see second and third generation effects of that sort of thing. Children growing up to people who have troubles with real attachments and believing in love, or of long-term relationships, becoming very utilitarian about relationships, having difficulty committing, etc., etc. Anyway, just briefly, the therapeutic pathway I referred to was, in simple terms, we shrink men back to their very primary stewardship, the very primary relationship they have, and that is the relationship with themselves. And no surprise, many men realise that the relationship they have with themselves is very poor, underdeveloped, and needing to get some work. The next level we walk them through is the relationship with their children. Any person's relationship with their children is primal. You know, we think that 3,000 or 4,000 years of civilization somehow takes us away from the fact that we are connected to kids in a very primal way. So we assist these men after they've done some personal work to make sure they're the best dad they can be, no matter what time they've got with their children. Then we get them to look at relationships with others, and we have a very important range of issues in terms of when to recognise you're ready for a new relationship. Many men, of course, enter new relationships prematurely. I think men and women can do that, and of course bring a whole lot of baggage with them into the new relationship. In fact, that first relationship has been in the literature identified as a transition relationship, and the casualty rate's somewhere around about 80%. Not good. Look, I'm not going to go through the week by week. Let me just tell you how excited we got, really excited about this. Now, the second speaker just dazzled me with all those stats. I'm actually, in another life, tutor stats, but I'd forgotten a lot of stuff. So I got this all independently done by a PhD student. And because the data set was so big, we were told that using the normal analyses, we had to go to what's called, I think, Pearson's D or something. But what we found out was that we were getting really statistically significant treatment effects in some very critical areas. For example, apparently anything above 0.3 is worth looking at. So many of these were above 0.3, and I was particularly interested in depression and anxiety, because it's that mixture of depression and anxiety that we see as sitting underneath this hostile alienation. Also with, importantly, containing suicide, aggression, all those sorts of strong emotional processing things. What we did find that normal kind of trait variables like dominance and warmth weren't really changed. And we probably would expect that wouldn't happen anyway. Okay. I've covered a lot, and that's the website, mends.com.au. And as I said, MENDS Pro, MENDS PRO, will give you access to all the stuff here and many other things as well, if you wish. Does anyone have any questions?